warmed up again anyway, so I'm going to ask you guys to do a little stretching exercise. Don't worry, you're not going to have to stand up. All you're going to have to do is raise your hand. Quick show of hands. How many of you have hands? Okay. All right. How many of you are sitting next to someone who has a hand but didn't raise it? Oh, I see. All right. It looks like most of you know the basics, so I think we can work with this. And we're gonna raise the stakes a little bit. We're gonna vote about some animals. How many of you like cats? All right, that's pretty many. How many of you like dogs? All right, a few more. All right. How about snails? I wasn't really expecting that many. No, things change. How about Harry? Okay, got some fart jokes this year. Okay. Did that make sense? We all understand that we like more than one animal, right? Yeah? Okay, that'll help with your dating profiles, but that means you guys sort of understand something called approval voting. So that's one method down. There's 3 more to go, but we'll get to that a little bit later. There is so much to talk about in voting that there's no way that I can get to all the stuff that I really want to get to. So if I pass on something that you guys are really interested in, get your pencil, your pen, write it down, and ask me afterwards. So, who am I? I'm Andrew. Why am I here? I'm only up here because I'm a voting nerd, and I asked Corey if I could do it, and he said yes. But I'm not an expert. I'm a software engineer. I don't do this for a living, so I might make a mistake. Don't shoot me. But I am a nerd. I'm a software engineer. I work on autonomous vehicles, and more importantly, I have a 5-digit Wikipedia ID. So lots of nerd cred. I'll get a bit of voting cred as well. I've voted in about 40 elections, if you include the primaries. So that might give you a sense of my age. But another thing that might give you a sense of my age is the first election that I should have voted. So if I say that I should have voted in that election, that tells you something went wrong. It turns out that independent is not a party. I thought it was, and because I didn't fill out that little bubble, I didn't get to vote in that election. So, for those of you who don't know, that was the infamous election of 2000. It was Bush versus Gore. At the time, it came down to Florida. And as we know, Florida can't get anything right. So it was Bush versus Gore, and according to the Supreme Court and the recounts, Al Gore lost by only 537 votes out of 5.9 million. That's 0.009%. But the election wasn't actually just between Al and George. You can see way down here, there was a whole bunch of other people, but because it was so close, that actually mattered. It turns out if any of the voters who picked these last 8 had a preference about the top 2, this election could have been different. But yeah, it wasn't between just George and Al. It was also between this guy, Ralph. Not that guy. So you can see that this is a log scale. If you want to see like how close it was, this is 537 votes. This is all of the people that got more than 537 votes. And many people think that Ralph was more similar to Al than he was to George. In our system, being similar to someone is bad if you want to win. And it's also, more importantly, bad for our country, because if you want people's preferences to matter, you don't want their vote to be thrown away. So it wasn't right away, but in the years after that election, the Iraq War happened. And pretty quickly we realized that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. And I started to think about, like, what would things have been like if that had been different? Like, a lot of people died in that war, and 2 new Supreme Court justices were selected. They're still there. 8 years of climate policy happened. It probably would have been different. So this stuff actually matters. While I was thinking about this, I found Wikipedia. It was fairly new, like 2003, 2004, 2005. But it already had a shitload of information. And this was one of the very first Wikipedia holes that I fell down. And this is the reason that I have a 5-digit Wikipedia ID. So I learned some things. You guys probably all have heard of the spoiler effect, but I learned that systems like ours are vulnerable to something called irrelevant alternatives, and that better systems are resistant and are independent to irrelevant alternatives. And I learned that our system was called first past the post, or plurality. That it's bad because it throws a whole bunch of information away and prevents third parties from ever becoming competitive. If you've ever heard that third parties don't win because of us, because we haven't been disciplined enough, this is provably wrong. This is provably wrong in game theory. The math of first past the post inevitably results in a two-party system. So I said our system was bad for Al and bad for the country. So the question is, what would have been a better option? To know that, you sort of have to ask, like, what's the purpose of voting? And I think it's pretty obvious that the purpose of voting is to select between a couple of options, between several options, and to take into account the collective preference of all the people who are voting. So if we ask, like, what does the collective preference mean? I think we could say that, like, if everyone prefers someone, or if there is a candidate that's preferred over all other candidates, that person should win. That seems like a pretty straightforward definition of what we want to happen. The simplest situation you can think of is pretty easy, right? Like, if you only have 2 options, like, it's just a matter of selecting between those and adding up, right? So that's easy. Basically, all of the systems behave in the same way. So that's not even interesting. The question is, what happens if you have more than 2, right? So if we all agree that, like, the 2-person situation is pretty easy, the question is, like, all right, well, could we just, like, extrapolate that to more? Can we take every pair of people and run a simulated election between those 2? And if someone wins all of those elections, they win. So let's say it was like 3. It was Al, George, and Ralph. If Al beat Ralph and Al beat George, then he would win, right? There's a name for this. It's a name that you guys probably have not heard of. It's called a Condorcet winner. So it's named after a guy, Nicholas de Condorcet. It's not very famous, but he probably really should be famous. Is this guy right here? He's pretty nerdy. He was famous among the nerds of his time. If he was alive today, he would definitely be giving a nerd night talk. might do a little better than me. I'm not sure. But he was famous in his time. He was friends with all these guys. Yes, he knew Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and for you math nerds, Leonard Euler here. Not Euler, yes. And for those social justice connoisseurs of you out there, he was ahead of his time. He's one of the few historical figures that passes the right side of the history test. He was a vocal, outspoken proponent of equal gender rights, equal race rights, equal religion rights, and he wrote about it. He wrote about it in a way that ended up in our Constitution. Like, he influenced all of these people, and our Bill of Rights and our Declaration of Independence, they have his influence. Unfortunately, he died for his ideas during the French Revolution. The infamous Robespierre and the Jacobins had him jailed, and he died in prison. But historical aside, the really important part is, for us at least, is that he figured out the math behind that multi-head election thing that I was talking about before. So, if I said, okay, the multi-head election thing sort of makes the two-party election thing work. So, what's the problem, right? Haven't we solved it? And Condorcet will tell you that no, we didn't. And the reason is something that you guys might actually already be aware of. How many people here have played rock, paper, scissors? You guys all know the rules? Any of you call it something other than Rochambeau or rock, paper, scissors? How many people prefer some other name? None? Okay, well, some people prefer rock, paper, scissors, rock, scissors, paper, rock. And the reason is because of the rules, right? Any one of those orderings can work. There is no one of them that beats the others. And this is fundamentally the problem in elections. And why this stuff is so complex. It turns out that if you have a bunch of people, if you have a bunch of people voting, it's possible to end up in this situation where people prefer Ralph over Al, and they prefer Al over George, but they prefer George over Ralph. That's a cycle, right? What are you gonna do about that? And this situation is exactly what Condorcet figured out. In fact, it's called the Condorcet paradox. It's got a whole bunch of other names like everything else in voting, but it's called the Condorcet paradox. And you might think that it's possible to solve this problem, right? You think okay, well, why would you let people vote in that way, where they said, well, I like Ralph more than Al, and I like Al more than George, and I like George more than Ralph. If you don't let people do that, you would think okay, maybe if we don't let them do that, we force them to rank in this order, we solve the problem, right? Well, no, unfortunately, even if every individual voter doesn't create that cycle, you can still end up with a cycle in the end. So now what, right? We have this way where we're oh, right, if this person beats everyone else, it's fine. And, in most cases, that's what would happen. You don't get ties all that often, but you can here. And the reason for that, the reason that this is so complex is because of that cycle. And there's a whole bunch of voting systems which are meant to solve this problem. So, it turns out that there is no perfect solution, but there are a lot of approximations that get way better than the system that we have now. You guys have probably all heard of instant runoff voting, IRV. Like everything in voting, it comes with a whole bunch of names. You might have heard it as ranked choice voting, which is extremely definitely misleading. And if you give me a chance to rant about this, I will. Ask me after. It turns out that there's a whole bunch of ranked methods, and IRB actually kind of sucks. And the rest of the ranked the methods have been sort of tainted by this. What's instant runoff voting? So instant runoff voting is done on a ballot like this. You rank your choices, but it still actually has a spoiler problem. So the way that it works is that you rank your choices. The counts are done for all of the whoever has the least first place votes gets eliminated. And then the process happens for the remainder. So this sounds pretty reasonable, but unfortunately, it's not. Because imagine if you have three, and everyone has a favorite extreme candidate, but everyone sort of agrees on a more moderate candidate. Well, if the moderate candidate is no one's first pick, it turns out they get eliminated in the first round. So IRB doesn't actually solve the spoiler problem. It might have solved the problem in the 2000 election. It really only works in elections where the third-party candidate has almost irrelevant number of votes. What I do like about IRB though is the ballot. This ballot can be used to find that winner that we were talking about before, the Condorcet winner. There's another system that you guys are already familiar with. It's called approval voting. That's what we did in the beginning with the animals. This is one of my favorites. And the reason that it's one of my favorites is because it's so simple. It probably looks a lot like the ballots you used before. The only difference is that you're allowed to mark more than one. It's better than FBTP, first past the post, our system, and it's better than instant runoff. But it has some problems on its own. It's one of the election systems that's being tried out across the country right now, along with IRB. And then finally, there's something called star voting. Star voting is kind of what it sounds like. If you're used to giving star rating on Amazon or for movies, it's very much like that. But what it is just an average. What happens is you vote for each person with a certain number of stars, and the tally is added up, and the top two winners are then done in head-to-head elections. So based on preference rather than total score. So I definitely didn't get to all the things that I would want to get, but I definitely didn't have time to do it either. So the question might be like, all right, well, what would I recommend? Someone who's a voting nerd who's really into this. And I can tell you anything other than first past the post is good, all right? So if you have a chance for instant runoff, that's fine. It's not great, but it's fine. If you have approval voting, I would take that over instant runoff voting. And then that star voting system that I mentioned is better than the other three, but it might be hard to convince people to get there. So I want a better voting system, and so does Bernie, because third parties can only work if we have a different voting system. So voting time again. I want to know a couple things. How many people learned something they didn't know about voting? All right, that's good. All right, this is my scary question. How many people found this confusing? Yep, okay, all right, that's fine. How many people are more interested in alternative voting systems than they were before? All right, that's good. And how many people found it so overwhelming and now don't want to think about it at all? All right, I'm good. Please go vote. the only way that we're ever going to change any of this is if you guys go out there and vote, even though our current system is broken. So please go out and vote, and please clap.